Module 1 will discuss the founding of American higher education, as well as the development of student affairs in American higher education. With this course, there are a few things to remember. First is, make sure and read all of the texts that are assigned for each week. These PowerPoints and the lectures that go with them will touch on key points from the readings. However, reading the text will allow you to understand those points further, as well as consider deeper aspects of the student affairs profession. Second, think critically and research. Find your own sources that will further allow you to understand specific areas of student affairs, and consider if those aspects of student affairs that you are reading are germane to what you are called to do within student affairs, whether they may be outdated practices or whether there may be next practices that you could develop that further encourage learning and development in students at 2- and 4-year institutions of higher education. Third, think practically and practice deep learning. As you are reading, you will be reading a good bit of research, and you will be thinking about philosophies in regards to student affairs. However, as you are reading, think about how you can take that knowledge and apply it to what you are doing now in student affairs or what you hope to do in student affairs. Practice deep learning, which simply means giving meaning to knowledge, understanding how to take that knowledge and apply it to everyday work and everyday living. And finally, remember that learning is forever. Just because you have taken this class does not mean that you are necessarily an expert in student affairs. However, you have been given a good base for understanding and working in student affairs. Continue to learn yourself and discover best practices that will allow you to further support student learning. The story of American higher education began with Harvard in 1636. Harvard had a classical curriculum and was focused more on producing leaders of the colonies in regards to the church and the state. It did not have a focus on jobs that typical laymen, quote unquote, would do, such as farming or such as running certain businesses, but instead was meant to produce leaders with an education heavy in philosophy and theology. There was a narrow group of individuals that could attend Harvard and then other schools as they began to develop in the colonies. The students who were allowed to attend were white males who were landowners. And these were not the traditional 18 to 22-year-old individuals that we see many times in colleges and universities today. These were young males, anywhere from 12 to 14 when they began, who again studied a classically focused curriculum. In these colleges, the faculty would live and teach the young men, and were the source of what we would call today student affairs, in that they would live in the residence halls, they would take meals with the students, they would be the ones who would handle conduct issues, and so it was very much a model of faculty invested in every aspect of the student's life. Higher education began to change, and in the mid-1800s, Michigan State was formed in Michigan, which was the first university really focused on the practical nature of education and how it translates into everyday jobs in society. That included agrarian focuses such as farming, also industrial focuses, and to an extent teaching. This was a novel idea and began to be the model for two acts that would be called the Morrill Acts. The Morrill Acts came from Senator Morrill out of Vermont, and what these two acts did, one in 1862 that was signed into law by President Lincoln, and one in 1890, These were acts where the U.S. government gave tracts of land to states so the states could set up universities that focused on practical education. So again, they focused on things such as farming, such as business, engineering, and to an extent, military. When you see colleges such as Texas A&M, Michigan State, North Carolina State, Alabama A&M, these are all universities that came out of the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890 to allow a greater opportunity for individuals to attend American higher education, but also to make a more practical education that wasn't just simply classically focused, but instead had an applicable nature to it in everyday life. As mentioned before, American higher education began to change in the 1800s, and with Michigan State being the forerunner of more of a practical-based education, higher education, there were also some colleges that one now is in the Ivy League that sought to blend the classical nature of education with the practical nature of education and applying that education to agrarian society, to industrial society, and to areas of this sort. One of these was Cornell University, founded by Ezra Cornell in 1865. And Ezra Cornell's main focus was to have a university that took a classical education, but also blended into it practical aspects of education so that the farmer or the industrialist would not only know how to do their job well, but would also have the philosophy and the understanding of history that Harvard and William and Mary and the University of Pennsylvania also had. The Morrill Act, which is also called the Land Grant Act, so as I said, with universities such as Michigan State, Texas A&M, North Carolina State, these universities that were formed out of the Morrill Act, these are called land grant universities, and this caused a greater population of American citizens to take part in higher education. However, there were individuals who were not allowed to take part in higher education, and students of color and women specifically were not allowed into universities such as Michigan State or such as Harvard. Oberlin was really the first college to allow women as well as black students to take part in classes with white students, but there were specific colleges that were set up for black individuals and for women so that they could get a higher education as well. Institutions that focused on black individuals were called HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities, with the first one being formed in Pennsylvania called Cheyney University. The first HBCU formed in the South post-Civil War was in Atlanta, and it came to be known as Clark Atlanta University. Eventually, students of all races would be allowed to take part in the broader scope of higher education. But again, these institutions were set up for the purpose of allowing black individuals and women to attend higher education and have access to education. Another piece of history, or another act that opened higher education to many individuals, was the GI Bill. The GI Bill was formed in 1944, and it was formed to give support to individuals coming back from war or who had served in the military. The GI Bill offered many possibilities for these individuals, funded by the government so that they could buy new houses with loans at a fair and decent rate, so that they could have their college paid for and develop skills and professions, and allowed for really a large segment of the population who would have never gone to college to have the opportunity to go to college and begin to develop what it was they wanted to do with their lives. The GI Bill was a massive, just like the Morrill Act, it was a massive, massive change to higher education and a wonderful opportunity for many more individuals to have access to higher education. And the GI Bill also changed post 9/11 in 2001 and afforded even more money available to veterans to continue their education. As mentioned before, the student affairs functions of colleges and universities from the inception of Harvard until really the late 1800s and early 1900s was handled by faculty. However, as the number of students who were matriculating at colleges and universities began to grow, colleges and universities saw that they needed more individuals to help with the everyday aspects of student life at colleges. Many faculty were unwilling to continue to serve in both functions and wanted to focus solely on teaching and research. And so colleges began to hire men's deans of students and women's deans of students who were focused on things such as conduct, things such as residence halls and living, and also fraternity, sorority, and organizational life at the universities. In 1918, a group of men's deans of students formed NASPA, which was the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. And in 1931, a group of women's deans met together and eventually formed ACPA, which is the Association of College Personnel Administrators. Both of these organizations are still in existence and are the two main student affairs organizations in the United States. These two groups were formed so that these individuals could, one, of course, network, but two, form a philosophy of what they did, form a philosophy of student affairs, which you will be reading about in your text, and also to share best practices of how to do their job well and develop student affairs from the infancy that it was in at that time. Student affairs at that time was more focused on service to students, but in the 1970s to 1990s began to focus on student development. They would ask the question, who are students and how do we help them develop into the individuals they desire to be? Around this time, especially in the 1980s, there was a huge focus on student development theory. And so this is a time when you will see many of the core theories of how students develop and find their identity having been founded. After that, in the 1990s, there became a philosophy focused on student learning came to the forefront of student affairs. So it wasn't just necessarily about helping students develop as people, but it was also about a co-curricular focus of we wanted students to develop and to understand who they were and to truly find their identity, but also we wanted students to learn and make the whole university experience one that was a learning experience. So co-curricular focus came to be, and what happened inside of the classroom was meant to be carried and engaged outside of the classroom through programming, through living learning communities, and through other aspects of the collegiate experience. So today, student affairs is truly focused on holistic learning and co-curricular opportunities for students to where they absolutely have the services they need to do the business of being a student, also to understand who they are and develop to become who they were meant to be. But finally, to take the lessons learned in the class and apply them or talk about them through opportunities of engagement outside of the classroom, including in residence halls and commuter collegiums, on the campus recreation fields, through academic advising, and many more aspects of student affairs.